Okay, so we are in YouTube. Guadalupe, si quieres podemos empezar.
Muy buenos días, les doy la más cordial bienvenida esta mañana al seminario Migración, Desigualdad y Políticas Públicas del Colegio de México. The session is going to be conducted in English. Hello, my name is Guadalupe González, Associate Professor at the Center for International Studies of el Colegio de México. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the first webinar of the series organized by the seminar Migration, Inequality and Public Policies of el Colegio de México as part of the project Migration, Migration Policy and Foreign Policy at the turn of 2020, which we have translated into Spanish more concretely as la intersección de la política exterior con la política migratoria en el México de hoy. This interdisciplinary project has gathered 9 researchers from el Colegio de México and aims to generate policy proposals towards a more comprehensive approach to address the different challenges that Mexico faces in the realm of migration, particularly bringing into account the foreign policy, regional and international dimensions of migration. This is the key of our project. This project is coordinated by Claudia Masferrer and Luisi Pedrosa, who are with us today. Let me turn now to my role as the moderator of this webinar. First of all, I ask everyone to make sure your microphones are muted so we don't have noise during the transmission. The name of today's conversation is What does the new Biden administration mean for immigration policy? Searching opportunities for policy reform and cooperation between Mexico and the United States. It is a particularly timing and relevant topic given the high expectations opened by the arrival of the new administration in the US, that the time might be ripe for a reforming and for fixing, hopefully, current migration and asylum systems in North America, Mexico, and Central America. Is a U-turn possible in times of pandemic, economic recession, and political polarization? Those are the questions. I want to thank each of our panelists for their generosity in devoting their time to this dialogue and the insights they will share with us today. I really cannot think of a better group of people to help us delve into this subject. This panel is unique, not only because of the speakers' individual expertise, but because together they bring a range of different perspectives and backgrounds. This diversity, I think, is key if we are to understand the complexities and uncertainties of current political transition in the US and its significance and consequences for Mexico as a country of emigration, immigration, transit, return, refugee, and as forced internal displacement. Let me start by presenting and welcoming them. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read their impressive curricula profiles, but can you see a very short resume on the screen? This morning, we have Alan Bersin with us, policy consultant at Covington Burling, Theresa Cardinal Brown, Director of Immigration and Border Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center, Dan Restrepo, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, Sarah Pierce, a policy analyst for the Immigration Policy Program at the Migration Policy Institute. Welcome, all of you. Let me explain to you a little bit the format and explain it to the audience. The format of today's event will be as follows. There will be 3 rounds, each revolving around specific questions, and each of our speakers will have 3 to 4 minutes to share their thoughts. We will be taking questions from our audience via the chat throughout the event, and at the end of the 3 rounds, we will select a few of these for our Q&A session. I want to tell the audience, we hope your questions may be directed to all 4 speakers. Although we will not have time to address every question, we welcome any and all, since they will contribute as feedback to the larger conversation that this project poses. Since the format is very dynamic, I will be strict timekeeper during the 3 rounds, and I ask our speakers to please make sure to keep their answer to the 3 times assigned. I will show this sign on the screen. This is a red sign, so you can see it when your time is up, giving you 30-40 seconds to wrap up your ideas. I will shift in the order in which the responses and intervention will take place in each round. The first round will focus on the analysis of Biden's immigration policy plan, the second on the obstacles ahead, and the third on challenges for bilateral cooperation. So we are ready to start, and let me pose to the panel the first question. To what extent, in your view, President Biden's immigration package of executive orders, legislative proposals adopted since day one in office represent a truly significant and sustainable change of U.S. immigration policy? I would like you to focus in those aspects you feel that are more important for Mexico and Mexicans residing in the United States, either border controls, path to citizenships, asylum seeking, cooperation with Central America. In your perspective, what is new and what is old in Biden's approach to immigration? Alan Bersin, could you begin, please? Alan, you are mute. Could you open your microphone?
For sure. Muy buenos dias. I'd like to thank Comex, Claudia Mascarer, Guadalupe, Lucy, and the team there for this opportunity to explore, as you will see, some critical issues. So the short answer is it's dramatically different, but yet it's composed of very much the same. What I think we saw on day one, both in the issuance of a comprehensive immigration bill, as well as a flurry of executive orders, many of which were focused on migration, but not exclusively so, was a dramatic restatement of what immigration reformers over the last 20 years have proposed to fix what is universally agreed upon in the United States to be a broken immigration system. Of course, there's been very little agreement on how that broken system might be reformed and fixed. And that political impasse continues today. But no question about it, the grouping and the aggregation of these proposals in the immigration bill, covering everything from family unification to border security to reform of the asylum system to workplace enforcement, all of the staples of the last generation's thoughts about how to reform our broken system actually present a new phenomenon, and a dramatically interesting and important one, because it brings together in one legislative bill all of these elements that have been dealt with, starting, of course, with relief for the DACA, deferred childhood arrival participants. Having said that, the political impasse that we've seen in this country in the last 15 years, to be sure, perhaps longer, continues, so that I don't think, and be interested in my colleagues' reaction, that there is very much of a likelihood that we could actually see a passage of bill in anything approaching this form during the first 2 years of the Biden administration. Of course, the same political dynamics exist in the country, but there will be, and there are chances, for example, with regard to DACA, where there's been bipartisan support that something could happen. But the more interesting, from my perspective, issue goes to the sustainability of the executive orders. So on day one, 6 of 8 or 6 of 7 executive orders dealt with migration, dealing a dramatic reversal in policy of many of the executive orders that Trump put in place during the term of his administration. And this is not an entirely new phenomenon, but I think it does present the risk of dramatic pendulum swings, which are not healthy in a political body or a political society for managing policies as important and complex as immigration. Two matters on sustainability. So in fact, Trump did not invent, obviously, the executive order, but what he did do was use it broadly and in many ways cruelly. And the Biden administration attempt to reverse that is actually going to face difficulties. While the Obama administration actually used executive orders to create the DACA program, it lost out judicially with the DAPA program, which was ruled unconstitutional by a Texas judge. So the Interior Enforcement Executive Order, actually, that was issued by the Biden administration has already been restrained by the court in Texas, by Judge Bolton, who issued a temporary restraining order. So I think two phenomenon, and this just to wrap up, is that we will end up with more executive orders, but also a much more involved role of the judiciary in certainly in the early stages of the Biden administration attempt to reform immigration.
Thank you, Alan. Theresa, in this mixture between the new and old things, what's your take on this?
I think I agree largely with Alan that many of the pieces, for example, in the legislative proposal that we've seen, are things that have been part of legislative proposals over the last 10 years or so. They're not necessarily unique. I think what is unique is the way they have been packaged, leading with legalization, and the broadest legalization that I think has ever been proposed in legislation. It would allow a pathway to citizenship of about 8 years in total for almost everyone who is in an undocumented status as of January 1st, 2021, which is a huge and broad legalization. Other parts of it is that there's very little on border security in the bill. What is there is a shifting away from the idea of border security being about absolutely about prevention of unlawful migration and more about facilitating legitimate trade and travel using technology. So there's not a significant border security piece. The changes around the legal immigration system, I would say, are not fundamental. There's not an absolute increase in the number of immigrants allowed in, nor the categories upon which they can enter. They are what I would call tweaks, although they're not insignificant. What I mean by tweaks is it is changing the allocation of how many visas any single country can get, or saying that employment-based immigrants are not limited by a per-country limitation. Those things are tweaks around the edges, but they're not a change substantially in how our legal immigration system works. It would allow more immigrants in, at least initially. But I think there's also a desire that many people have had to sort of look at the legal immigration system and make some more fundamental changes. So that may be an area of future discussion, particularly on a bipartisan basis, as I think future workforce needs are not necessarily addressed by this proposal. With regard to the executive actions, I agree with Alan. What we have seen so far and what we expect will be a reversal of as many of the executive actions of the Trump administration as possible. What we don't yet know is exactly what they may be replaced by. Are we just going back to, if you will, the policies that that were in place before Trump arrived, or are we doing something different? And I think what the major area we have yet to see on that is what is going to happen at the border. There has been many calls for Biden to immediately roll back, for example, the migration protection protocols or the Title 42 expulsion ban for the pandemic, or the asylum cooperation agreements with Central America. And yet he has not done that, in part, I think, because proposing the alternative system that would replace that is necessary, and having that in place is necessary before you really start to roll those things back. Or we will be in a situation, as we were before Trump arrived, of frankly, too many people in insufficient infrastructure, vulnerable populations in a bad situation without adequate medical care, and a continuing backlog of the asylum system. So that's not acceptable either. I absolutely agree with Alan that the amount that can be done by executive action is going to be limited. What we saw in the Trump administration, because Trump relied so heavily on executive actions, the response to that by advocacy groups and others was lawsuits. And we saw a beginning of that in the Obama administration, as Alan mentioned, with the lawsuit over the DAPA program, but it was exponentially grown during the Trump administration as the advocates saw their only way of preventing these outcomes was taking the government to court. They won some cases, they lost some cases, many cases are unfinished, and the Biden administration inherits those litigations that could, at the end, depending on how they are settled out, create constraints for what he can do administratively going forward. And certainly now we have seen already that those who oppose the moves the Biden administration is going to take will also start litigation. In the end, it remains that Congress is the one that ultimately has to set our immigration policies. They have to get back in the game, if you will, and they have to find a way through the partisanship and intransigence that has characterized the last decade and a half.
Thank you very much, Theresa. I'm glad you brought the question of border security. Is there a trade-off between the different parts or pieces of this big package? Dan, could you share your thoughts with us?
Certainly. Y primero que todo, muchísimas gracias al Colegio de México por la invitación. It's a pleasure to be here and pleasure to be on such a distinguished panel. So look, I think there's a pretty significant change here that is apparent or is beginning to be apparent from what has been done to date in the Biden administration. I think when we're on the other side of Friday, it'll be a little bit more apparent in terms of the theory of the case of what you do to replace the Trump approach. Rather than going back to status quo ante, I think there's the notion is to do something kind of fundamentally different. And what is that fundamental difference? That fundamental difference is to treat two things: is to understand the migratory system as a migratory system, and that also speaks to the foreign policy issues, and we'll get to that later. And so, kind of creating, accessing, and leveraging kind of all of the levers available to the United States government to manage migration, rather than to be principally focused on preventing and deterring migration. And I think that's a pretty fundamental difference that doesn't occur overnight by any stretch of the imagination. And kind of the dimmer switch on the Trump approach and the dimmer switch in the opposite direction of the Biden approach is going to be very delicately balanced and is going to be tricky to execute. I also think the other indication, there's a saying in Washington, and I'm a firm believer in it, that people are policy. And I think it's really important to look at the team of people whose job it is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in the Biden White House to focus on this issue set. It's a pretty different lineup than we've seen in the past, right? Roberta Jacobson was named as the White House border coordinator. That speaks to somebody who understands that this is a migratory system and not just something that can be dealt with at a physical border. Katie Tubin, who's the new senior director of the Transborder Directorate within the National Security Council's last job was with UNHCR. Her deputy, Andrea Flores, last job was with the ACLU. Esther Rodriguez, who's on the Domestic Policy Council, is a longtime reform advocate, as is Tyler Moran, also in the DPC. So I think it also tells you that directionally, the Biden administration is not just going to undo and seek to undo what Donald Trump did, but rather build something new and something kind of more integrated to manage migratory flows throughout the system. So that's new about it. It also, quite frankly, in the design of the legislation that was sent to Congress or proposed for Congress, it at the very least, it stops negotiating against itself. Prior comprehensive immigration reform approaches were to load up on border security, some of it the theater of border security, in the hopes of convincing the other side to do legalization. In my view, that was always a bad faith negotiation from the other side, that there was no level of border security that was going to placate those who were peddling the idea that you can have that negotiation. At the very least, the Biden proposal doesn't get ahead of itself in that negotiation. It rather focuses on the legalization aspects and leveraging what has been a massive investment over the course of the last 2 decades in border security. And finally, kind of what's old here, still hampered by an infrastructure, a migration infrastructure that was built, and border security infrastructure that was built for a different era, and still hampered by politics and, quite frankly, nativist politics that sadly are kind of alive and well in the United States House of Representatives and in the United States Senate, which is going to make legislative advancements, which I agree are fundamental, quite difficult to achieve.
Thank you, Dan. Very important, the systemic approach and the bureaucratic changes that is taking this administration. Sarah, please, it's your turn.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me. I agree with a lot of what my co-panelists said, and maybe disagree with just a little bit. I think, to be honest, the day one actions, right, which included these executive actions and this really remarkable legislative proposal, I think the most significant change about them was the notification that immigration was going to be a priority during this administration, with so much else going on and with so many other significant priorities that they espoused on the campaign trail and since the election. It was really remarkable that immigration played such a big day on the president's first day in office. As far as the actual changes themselves, there wasn't a lot going on. So we had these executive actions, each of which just reversed or started the process of reversing Trump policies, but there wasn't a lot to them. One of my colleagues even equated them to tweets. The text was quite small, and when you compare these to the initial executive actions of Donald Trump, which were extensive, which were pages and pages and really dictated very specific policy changes, it was kind of a new day. And I don't mean to belittle President Biden's day one executive actions on immigration. Obviously, they were very significant. It was significant that he rolled back the travel ban. It was significant that he rolled back Donald Trump's immigration enforcement priorities and started the process of putting his own in place. But they weren't dictating a lot. But at the same time, he put forward this legislative proposal that was quite extensive. It's a bit of a hodgepodge, right? It's all over the place, but it's touching each part of the immigration system. And I think the kind of symbolism in that, at least for what I read into it, was that they're putting the onus on Congress. And I think that's really important because that's where it belongs, right? We've had more than 3 decades of Congress failing to pass any significant legislation on immigration other than enforcement. It's time for Congress to get in, and that would, prevent that pendulum swing that Alan spoke about, that where we have a Congress continuing to sit out on immigration, a president continuing to expand his authority on immigration, and then the courts constantly, batting that back a little bit along the way. But we still have this expansive presidential authority on immigration. It would be great to finally get congressional participation, even if, all of us, who can possibly be optimistic right now about Congress's ability to participate. But at the very least, a president who's espousing unity, hopefully is the right one to deliver some sort of change on immigration legislation, which, we're all hopeful to see.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that you made very important points. Precisely this shift between executive to Congress, because any sustainable change has to go through Congress. So, well, let's move to the second round of questions. These are going to be around the obstacles ahead. Which national and international obstacles to the implementation, not only to the design of the migration policy changes proposed by the new administration, can you foresee which are the most important? Can you see ways in which Mexico could accompany the process? Which are the chances of Biden's immigration reform bill in Congress and courts? What's your take on where the Republican Party is going to move Theresa, would you like to start this second round of our conversation?
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. There's a lot there. I think we've already pointed to some of the domestic obstacles, right? I think we've all pointed to the historical gridlock in Congress. It's worth saying that although President Biden saw a Democratic majority in the House and nominatively in the Senate, it's still very narrow. So the Democrats actually lost seats in the House. So that means that there's less wiggle room, if you will, for opposition to what Democrats want to move in the House on immigration or anything else, or they have to try to get some Republicans on board. And watching Nancy Pelosi over the last several years negotiate between the moderates and the progressive wing of her own party to keep everybody together, I think that's going to be continuing and be even more important with a smaller majority in the House. In the Senate, it's not an outright majority. It's a 50-50 split. The only reason that Democrats would control the floor is because under a 50-50 split, the vice president has a tie-breaking vote whenever there is a tie in the vote. So theoretically, the vice president either has to be available every time there's a vote to break a tie, or you have to figure out how you pick up at least one person from the other side of the aisle to vote with you on any measure. And we have seen that so far, Senator Schumer and Senator McConnell have not worked out any sort of formal agreement on how they are going to work sharing power in the Senate so that, for example, committees can continue to meet and things can proceed through committees to the floor. Without that agreement, it is very easy for Republicans to delay and stall anything in the Senate. And so that is the biggest obstacle. What was very difficult before because of partisanship is even more challenged because you don't have that large majority to work with. And so I think what we've seen so far is at least the Biden administration wants to try to see what they can do on a bipartisan basis. My guess is that this bill, when it's finally introduced in text, is not the end point. It is a starting point. It is definitely an indicator of the direction the Biden administration wants to go. I agree with Dan. It's a definite signal of a change in priorities, but it speaks to a legislative strategy basically saying to Republicans, tell us what you want and we'll figure it out from there, but we're not going to propose what we think you would want at this time. And we'll see if that actually gets anywhere. I'm not sure the Republicans know what they want at this point in time, or if their answer is just going to be no. You asked also about, we also mentioned sort of the court cases, the litigation. Trump dealt with this his entire presidency. We are seeing now that activist attorneys general in the states, just like there were Democrat activist attorneys general suing the Trump administration, you're going to see Republican activist attorneys general suing the Trump administration. That's going to be a constant battle throughout this administration on a lot of its executive actions, I believe. The last question about what can be done with Mexico, I think, in cases of the bilateral relationship, so much matters from the top down. What is the relationship President Biden will have with López Obrador and AMLO? If that, we saw an interesting shift from AMLO from the beginning of the Trump administration, where he was kind of standing up for Mexico, we're not going to be bullied, to at the end not acknowledging Biden's victory, right? So they've had a phone call, I understand. I'm not sure we know what exactly came out of that phone call, or the reading of the tea leaves of whether or not they have a good relationship. But certainly anything that the Biden administration wants to do to manage migration in the region, as Dan said, to work with Mexico in doing that, which will be a key player, it's got to start from how is that relationship and move on from there. And if signals are good there, then I think they can work some things out. But we're still very much at the beginning to see where that's going to go.
Thank you, Theresa. Dan, let me talk to you. Do you see any bureaucratic resistance or any other kind of?
Of course there will be. So a couple of thoughts, and let me go from kind of geographically, answer your question geographically rather than thematically. So from north to south. Theresa pointed out a 50-50 Senate is a challenge, and it's a challenge for everything. Right now, you're hard pressed to find 51 votes to declare today, Wednesday, in the United States Senate. So there's going to be a real challenge there when it comes to substantive differences between the two parties. as you point out, there's going to be a bureaucratic resistance, right? The Department of Homeland Security is best understood as a series of quasi-independent departments and agencies under the umbrella of one department that have very different views on the question of how migration should be addressed or managed. And I think there will be some real work to be done with the workforce to ensure that the policies that come from the Oval Office, that come from hopefully soon to be confirmed Secretary Mayorkas, are actually implemented on the ground. We saw that during the Obama administration, and I think that will absolutely be a factor here. Going to the border itself, I think it's remarkable we've gotten this far into this conversation without anybody mentioning COVID-19. The operational challenge of managing a border and managing protection mechanisms and even managing enforcement systems while also responsibly dealing with public health is a fundamental challenge that makes all of this work that much harder. And it also impacts on kind of the regional piece. I'm going to skip Mexico because I'll focus more on the bilateral relationship in response to the third question. In terms of one of the regional challenges of a management system is that it requires protection mechanisms to not just be the exclusive domain of the United States. It can't be that those who are seeking, rightfully seeking protection can only find it in the United States, in the Western Hemisphere. So it needs to be a much more robust set of protection mechanisms in each of the countries for either the internally displaced, for folks seeking refuge from other countries. And that is always going to be hard, and it's even harder right now in a hemisphere that is perhaps the most impacted by the pandemic, with the economic wreckage that the pandemic has created, and with a recognition that the Central American migratory phenomena is the second largest migratory phenomena that is unfolding in the Western Hemisphere right now. And the Venezuelan migratory phenomena is significantly larger and has placed pressure on the limited protection systems and that do exist elsewhere in the hemisphere that you would otherwise want to partner with in the context of managing Central American migration. So the pandemic and its after effects and this kind of lack of a robust set of protection mechanisms outside the United States, I think is a fundamental challenge that is going to need to be addressed. And I think it's on the minds of the Biden team, but it needs to be on the minds of folks in capitals throughout the Western Hemisphere in a way that I don't think it is today.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan, for your rich response. Sarah, would you like to follow up on this, on the obstacles?
Sure. So of course, we're talking about two tracks of changes, right? We're talking about the executive action changes and then the legislative changes, what can be done with Congress. On the executive action side, of course, the pandemic is huge and bandwidth that comes with that. The executive only has so much bandwidth to tackle the problems before it, and the pandemic is looming large, but also other problems that relate specifically to the mission of the Department of Homeland Security, which is the lead agency on immigration. We had a massive cybersecurity attack. We also had a domestic terrorist attack on the Capitol. These will pull at the Department of Homeland Security and prevent them from going after the executive actions that they might want to pursue on immigration, or at least limit it. Regarding the southern border, Theresa touched on this a little bit. It's a really difficult and impossible situation that I will hope to see the new administration working closely with Mexico on. They are tasked right now with untangling everything that President Trump put in place on the southern border, while also trying to modernize the resources and procedures at the southern border to handle the current flows that we're seeing, because they're currently very ill prepared to handle vulnerable populations, and also trying to stave off a surge before those resources are ready. And that's something I would, as I said, hope and expect the Biden administration to work closely with Mexico on. On the legislative side, obviously, we've all touched on the difficulties before Congress. Of course, bandwidth is also an issue for Congress. Congress is also dealing with this unprecedented pandemic and the public health and economic crisis that comes with it. There are some creative workarounds that Democrats could use to try to get immigration legislation through without a lot or any Republican participation. Specifically, I'm thinking about reconciliation bills where Democrats could get them through the Senate with 51 votes. Obviously Democrats are not always unified on immigration, so that alone could still be a challenge. And just really anything focusing on legalizing before Congress is going to be difficult right now with the pandemic and unemployment looming. It's going to be really politically difficult to get buy-in on mass legalization when there are so many unemployed in the United States.
Thank you, Sarah. Alan, let's end this round of a conversation around the obstacles with you. You have a long experience dealing with policy issues in the front at governmental level. Do you foresee any political backlash soon because of this shift, or any bureaucratic politics kind of obstacles? Because it's not only the question of resistances, but also how to coordinate such a huge administrative apparatus, or at the local level, communities in the border or in cities. What's your take on this kind of obstacles?
So the answer is yes, yes, and yes. At every level, you're going to see it. My colleagues have described the political impasse, remembering that 72 million Americans voted for Trump and for his agenda. So we have a massive set of problems. In fact, perhaps the biggest obstacle is the context itself. What President Biden faces is a triple whammy of the kind we've never greeted an incoming president with. He's got an economic situation that arguably is worse than that faced Roosevelt coming in the Depression in 1933. And he's got to deal with a political situation that as it approaches the situation facing Lincoln in terms of a divided country, then over slavery, now over a whole variety of issues. And on top of that, we have the pandemic, the opioid contagion that is raging around the country, and frankly, a migration crisis that is brewing and already developing in Guatemala and Honduras, and soon in Mexico. For example, we're seeing La Bestia, the train, is now filling up with Central Americans, and while INAMI is enforcing, the issue is, will there be a longer range issue that we can cover in the third round? But the circumstances make all of this exceedingly difficult. We dealt in the first round with the idea of executive action in terms of changing particular elements of immigration law, and with Sarah's caveats, they will have an impact, but they will be challenged at the local level. They will be challenged in Congress. They will be challenged at the state level and in litigation throughout the country. But let's focus for a minute on the COMEX's study, which is looking at the relationship between migration, management, and foreign affairs. I would argue that in a global age, picking up where Dan left off, that in fact migration management is as much about foreign affairs as it is about domestic politics and policies. It's clear, given the crisis that's unfolding now with renewed caravans and the like, that unless Mexico steps in, and this is central, unless Mexico continues to work with the Biden administration to control and contain those flows, we will be back soon where Trump was in May of 2019, with 144,000 Central American migrants, largely at the border. So this is the issue of bilateral cooperation with Mexico and with Central America. It's largely a matter of foreign affairs. How are we going to actually manage these transnational flows in a way that is right? Now, Trump arguably bludgeoned President Lopez Obrador and Ministro Ebrard into basically deploying the National Guard and accepting the Espera en Mexico program, the so-called migration protection protocols. Will that continue? We have 55,000 people at Mexico's northern border, tens of thousands of people preparing to cross Mexico's southern border and already doing so. And unless there's bilateral cooperation, this will soon mushroom into something that will be on the pages of every paper in the United States and Mexico.
Thank you, Alan. Let's move into our third round on bilateral cooperation. Let me share with you the questions we have prepared. What are the implications of Biden's immigration policy actions and plans for bilateral and regional cooperation? Are there institutional obstacles and political obstacles for a constructive bilateral dialogue on migration between the two countries linked to the political transition in the US? Which would be your suggestion at a very concrete level for a good bilateral conversation? Do we need new mechanisms? Which type of mechanisms would be needed? And if you could tell us a little bit about the specific aspects or issues that you see are the most important, the relevant ones, the more urgent for this cooperation over the next 2 years, I would encourage you to, if possible, to take the regional dimension into our conversation, bringing Central America, and if you want, also let's start thinking about models of migratory cooperation outside North America. Is something out there that might be helpful in this following 2 years? Sarah, would you be so kind to give us your thoughts?
Absolutely. So there's no doubt that the Biden administration is going to approach this with more of a focus on regional cooperation than we saw during the Trump administration. And I think they signaled that on the first day. The immigration bill it was just a proposal on the first day, but the proposal that they put forward was replete with more of a focus on the region than we had seen previously. Regional processing centers, significant investment, and even eventually envisioning regional burden sharing. So I hope that that's the tone they intend to set. Obviously, there hasn't been a lot of regional cooperation yet. This administration did not communicate with leaders of foreign countries before coming into office, or at least didn't communicate much or quite directly. So, that's work that we can expect to start seeing unfolding in the coming weeks, but really hasn't happened very much so far. As far as what that work is going to look like, at the risk of repeating myself, I'm extremely distracted by the southern border and the many pressures there. And I think all of us are, because it is a really difficult situation. There is massive pressure on President Biden to undo everything that Trump did at the southern border. And indeed, on his first day in office, they ceased enrolling new individuals into MPP. But there's still the reality that there are 25,000 active MPP cases, and there's lots of pressure on Biden to address those, in addition to everyone else waiting at the northern border who might have been metered previously or just looking for an opportunity to enter the United States. There's massive pressure on Biden to revoke the order put into place by Trump's director of the CDC, which mandates the expulsion of all unauthorized immigrants who arrive at the southern border, even asylum seekers. But obviously that order is kind of the one thing holding the system into place right now. So the Biden administration is in a very difficult spot. I'm hoping that bilateral or really ideally regional cooperation plays a big role into undoing that mess.
Thank you, Sarah. I know we are talking about the US, but to a certain point, it could be important also to think about how Mexico has to organize itself for a better conversation with the US. Dan, could you talk about this or anything you want to talk about?
So certainly, and that actually goes to one of the points that I was going to make. I think there's an institutional challenge that lies ahead, in part for the government of Mexico, with the reinstitutionalization of the relationship by the United States government. There is not going to be, to borrow a phrase from a different era, una ventana única at the White House for Mexican interlocutors to come discuss the relationship with. This will be, as it should be, in the hands of the Secretary of State on issues of migration, also the Secretary of Homeland Security. But there won't be a one-stop shop at the White House, which I think the last two governments of Mexico got quite accustomed to over the course of the last 4 years. And that's going to pose, I think, something of an institutional challenge within the government of Mexico itself. And quite frankly, I'm not sure either government has ever gotten itself properly organized to manage what is the most intense bilateral relationship that exists and the most complex bilateral relationship that exists in the world. The United States government also will have a challenge by reinstitutionalizing. One of the challenges of having multiple actors in the United States government interacting ideally with multiple actors on the Mexican side is coordination, is just the mechanics of interagency coordination on the U.S. side, and then obviously on the for Mexico on the Mexican side. Alan and I live this firsthand in terms of trying to create a quite structured both interagency process on the United States side on security cooperation, for example, with a set of counterparts and departments and agencies of the Mexican government. That worked well. It wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. Similarly, on the economic side, later in the Obama administration, there was the high-level economic dialogue that took place. That again, in that case, chaired by then Vice President Biden, but was looked for structured mechanisms that involved all the relevant players in each government having one conversation as best we could. And I think that's going to be necessary here. And I think the other challenge that's going to come in the bilateral relationship and as in the reinstitutionalization of the bilateral relationship is actually our interests are pretty well aligned, I think at a fundamental level on issues of migration. But what's going to happen when other issues that are going to be a little bit more frictiony come up in the bilateral relationship? How is that going to affect, or will it affect, issues of migration cooperation? And finally, I think we have a shared challenge looking at the region. One of the real obstacles to regional cooperation on migration with Central America is the quality and characteristic of the governments of Central America. The folks who were participating in the January 15th caravana, as they left San Pedro Sula, they were chanting "Fuera Juan Orlando, fuera," which is not exactly a migration slogan. It's very much about a president of quite dubious legitimacy in terms of the last election that was held in Honduras, who has serious allegations against him in courts in the United States. And if that's your partner, you're going to have a challenge working with partners of that nature. It's important, I think, that for the United States and Mexico to find common cause to lift up civil society actors. And I think there's a really important role for civil society to play in the United States, Mexico, and particularly in Central America in trying to manage migration in a safe, orderly, and humane way throughout the entire migratory chain.
Thank you, Dan. Those are great points. Alan, could you follow?
Yeah. I think Dan correctly characterized the infrastructure that was built over, starting actually in the Bush administration, but really developed by the Calderon and Peña Nieto and Obama administrations. That infrastructure has been maintained through the Trump years, but not the substance hasn't really gone through that, because in fact we had a Cordillo in the United States who didn't pay attention to the bureaucracy. and never would. So dealing with the issues that we have to deal with now, we have to recognize that in many ways, AMLO is a centralized force in the Mexican situation, very much in different circumstances the way Trump operated. But let's the good news is that there is an agreement now in the Biden administration, never delivered on by the Trump administration, of dealing with the push factors out of Central America, dealing with the development issues, taking on the notion that we need to actually deal with the countries of origin. AMLO believes that firmly, and that's the positive dimension. There are, however, negative dimensions. La Fe Cienfuegos, and the law that has resulted as a result of that basically centralizes U.S. law enforcement cooperation through SRE in a way that was dramatically different from the way in which the Obama administration was able to work cooperatively in extraordinary ways with the Mexican government. This law that requires that coordination is a real obstacle to this. The second a real obstacle, I think, is that we're going to see we have already seen a real change in the nature of migration. We all know from the Pew Report of 2017 that more Mexicans were leaving the United States voluntarily and involuntarily than entering legally and illegally. That's not the case. In fact, as we speak, more than half of the migration at the U.S. southern border in terms of apprehensions is actually Mexican. And in August, as early as August, it was 85% of the apprehensions were Mexican. So the dislocation, the contraction in Mexico, the push factors of the pandemic have actually changed the nature of migration back again in a way that will deeply affect bilateral relations in ways that were not true in the last several years, when largely it was an issue of Central American migration. So this is going to be a real a challenge to recreate the kind of cooperation. For example, the Mexican Congress, in a law not very well noticed in the United States, has actually mandated that INAME, the migration agency, is no longer entitled to detain migrants who are traveling with children. Well, that sends the message to the smugglers that we've seen in past years of, you enlist children in ways that are very detrimental to young children, and you bring them along. And in fact, we've seen that the main detention center in Tapachula has already been converted into a shelter to house families en route to the United States. So institutionalization, the institution is there, but will not likely be used. And the politics will determine the politics of relationship between AMLO and Biden will determine this, and that remains to be seen.
Wow, it looks kind of a very challenging future ahead with us. Theresa, it's your turn. Could you finish this round?
Sure. I mean, I think the fellow panelists have articulated a lot of the issues. Certainly, I think the institutional ones are key. But I also think that there is a contextual one, which is historically U.S.-Mexico dialogue around migration has been strictly bilateral. It has been one of a number of things going back to the Bush administration and the Security Prosperity Partnership. It's just sort of one in a slot of things. It has never taken priority or been addressed on its own as an important issue. I think that Mexico now becoming a transit country, a migration receiving country, as well as a migrant sending country, maybe creates an opening for a much more structured dialogue on managing migration in the entire region, and that Mexico can be doing more than just advocating for its own nationals in the world of migration, but really seeking bilateral solutions that we can lead together to deal with the regional phenomenon of migration. Mexico has to step up as a leader. It cannot be the United States going bilaterally to every country and negotiating agreements the way Trump did at the point of a gun, frankly, in terms of foreign aid or trade. But it needs to be a set of cooperative mechanisms that also do something that Mexico has not been willing to do: invite in refugee resettlement organizations, invite in UNHCR, let them help manage the flows, create pathways for those who deserve protection that don't require them to arrive to the border before seeking protection. The Biden administration has talked about that, reinstituting the Central American Minors Program and the parole program, humanitarian parole program. Now, that's going to be important as an alternative mechanism for those who are eligible and need protection. But we have to recognize that these flows are not strictly about asylum protections, right? There's definitely economic factors. And in particular, because we are seeing, as Alan said, a re-increase in Mexican migration that is primarily economic driven. So, to the extent that we don't have alternative legal mechanisms for people who are seeking economic opportunity, reforming our refugee and asylum process, even doing something regionally on that side, is not going to address all the pressures. The Biden folks have absolutely put root causes first, and that is important, but that is also a very long-term prospect. If we want to affect migration in the medium term, short or medium term, we have to address legal pathways. We have to do things like figure out, is there a regional work visa that we create? How do we encourage more Central Americans to take advantage of the visas we have that are mostly used by Mexicans, like the H-2A and the H-2B visa? And we need to look at the whole system, as Dan said. I agree. In terms of how we make that work, I'm a little concerned that if we leave State Department and DHS sort of in charge, we've seen, I worked in the Bush administration during the SPP, and what we saw, frankly, was that there's a little bit of an internecine battle, sibling rivalry, if you will, probably a little more than that, between State Department and DHS over migration issues in the region and who should be in charge. So they're going to need some supervision. They're going to need someone to say, no, this is what you're going to do and how you're going to do it together. Because otherwise, DHS looks to its own mandate, which frankly is border security and immigration management, not foreign policy. The extent to which DHS has been involved in foreign policy in the region, it has all been about either investigation of migrant smuggling organizations, which is valid, or deterrence of migrants. And so if we want DHS to be involved in a broader discussion about managing migration and not just all about deterrence, they're going to have, I think, some White House supervision. Ali Mayorkas is going to need some help with that institutional intransigence that exists within the Department of Homeland Security. And the State Department, frankly, has to have a better understanding and knowledge of the imperatives of DHS, which I don't think they do. So yes, Mexico has its own institutional things to figure out, but we have to first get our house in order and then present kind of a united front to Mexico and then challenge them to respond, I think, with an appropriate institutional framework that can interact in a very proactive, positive way. I would like to see something like a high-level dialogue on migration with regular meetings. That's not just when we can schedule them, but quarterly. We need to get back to that kind of rigor to really engage. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. You've done such a great job. Really, it's so many food for thought and for coordination and for political action, transnational political action in our area in order to fix this disorder that we have. Okay, we are going to move into the Q&A session. I'm going to read 3 of the questions and pose them to all of you. The first question, would the third safe country agreements with Guatemala and Honduras continue? Could you please elaborate on this? Which things can we be done to reform the actual mechanisms? Another question is a very interesting one because it has to do with the trade-off between border safety and movement through border, and it has to do with the caravanas. Will the next caravanas from Honduras, the first test in this issue for the bilateral relationship between Mexico and the United States, what's the scenario you foresee? Do you have any information of any bilateral dialogue going on this issue right now? And the third question, everybody says that this is an excellent panel, but the question is, do you foresee an increase in legal paths to migrate to the US for unskilled people from Mexico and Central America in order to ease the consequences of the pandemic in this country, or for skilled people? What about the effects of the pandemic in the US labor market? I think those are excellent questions. And who would like to start? Just raise your hand.
I'll start with the last question, if you don't mind, because I mentioned legal immigration pathways in my last answer. I think the challenge there is that it is very difficult for the administration to greatly enlarge legal immigration pathways without congressional action. And we all have talked about how difficult getting legislation is going to be. So absent a change in legislation, what can the administration do? I think there are some things that can be done. First of all, the H-2A category, which was for agricultural employment, is uncapped. So theoretically, there is no limit to how many people could use that category. The practical limitations of the H-2A category are the challenges by the employers in the United States in actually utilizing the category. The labor market tests, the wages, all of those kinds of things create challenges for employers. It's bureaucratic, it's difficult. Farmers and growers in the United States usually employ labor contractors, and those labor contractors had developed great relationships with people in Mexico, but they don't have any relationships with people in Central America. So what incentives could be provided to encourage them to reach into Central America and encourage more Central Americans to migrate under that category? There have been some efforts. You could maybe give a preference or allow people coming from Central America to stay a little longer in sequential categories. There are some administrative things that might be possible to encourage the use of that category. The H-2B category, which is non-agricultural temporary work, is capped. And so that is a stricture. But in recent years, Congress has allowed the Department of Homeland Security to extend that or expand that in cases where employers have difficulty hiring people. So there might be opportunity there. Again, you have the labor contractor issue and building relationships in Central America for them to recruit people in Central America to come on those visas. There's also the challenge in those countries of actually obtaining the visas. We have a series of consulates around Mexico that people can go to apply for their visa. In the Central American countries, it's usually just the embassy. And that's hard for some people to get to. So what can we do administratively to facilitate visa application in those countries? Lastly, about skilled immigration, again, high skilled immigration to the extent that's possible exists under the H-1B category, which is capped. There's a lot of issues around how that category is run right now. I think that the opportunities there are much more limited without legislative change. But I do think that we need to think differently about legal pathways and labor migration. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the high unemployment rate in the United States, as Sarah mentioned earlier, will be an obstacle to expanding work-based migration in the United States right now. However, over the long term, we definitely know that we need increased labor force participation in the United States. We need more workers because our population is aging and shrinking in the workforce. So while right now the political situation would make it very challenging, it should be on the table for longer term discussion.
Thank you, Theresa. Sarah, you rose your hand.
Sure. So I mean, Theresa did a great job addressing that last question. I will say that the Biden administration did have an expansion of legal pathways for unskilled labor in their bill. So it is something that we at least know is on their minds. As far as the Safe Third Country agreements, also called the Asylum Cooperation Agreements with Central America, the Biden administration, or rather President Biden himself, did say before the inauguration and maybe even before the election that he would revoke those. We have not heard them speak on them, since then and since the inauguration, but that promise is there. I would expect them to end those agreements, at least as they're written. There's certainly interest in this administration in regional burden sharing, but I think there's wide recognition that the Northern Triangle countries are not yet ready for that burden sharing. And the agreements as written are really wild. They're not safe third country agreements. They don't require asylum seekers to pass through those countries and apply for asylum there before coming to the United States. Rather, they enable the United States to export any asylum seeker they want. They could send a Mexican national to Guatemala under those agreements. They could even send an Indian national to Honduras under those agreements as written. So I don't think that there's a realistic future for those agreements.
Great. Dan, would you like to answer some of the questions, and then will be the turn of Alan?
So a couple of quick things. I think a number of these questions that we've addressed today, we'll have a lot more clarity on by Friday afternoon. So Friday, we're anticipating a significant number of additional actions by President Biden on these issues. And so I think that'll shed a fair amount of light and kind of reinforce the directionality that one can glean, as Sarah has done so well, from the legislative proposal and from the executive actions that have taken place to date. But chief among them, I can't imagine the asylum cooperation agreements are going to last much longer than the end of this week, given what, again, candidate Biden made very clear, President-elect Biden made very clear. I'd be quite surprised if President Biden broke with that clear trend line. In terms of the caravans, I think the caravans are interesting in that they garner an enormous amount of attention, but actually account for very little of the migratory flow. And I think it's important to remember that. Do I anticipate the next caravan to be treated, substantially differently than the previous one? No. I think the interests of the various governments involved are very similar this week as they were last week. And so I don't anticipate kind of a radical change in posture from the government of Guatemala or the government of Mexico with regard to kind of these high profile migratory events. And I think we have to kind of understand them as high profile migratory events that are are the tip of the iceberg, as it were, to the migratory flows that are increasing and that are undoubtedly increasing and are increasing in part based on a lot of misinformation and disinformation that smugglers are providing to people who are in desperate situations. I mean, we cannot also forget that Northern Central America and Southern Mexico, for that matter, got hit by 2 once-a-century storms in the course of 2 weeks in late 2020, and that's obviously adding to the suffering in the region, and provides, unfortunately, folks who can be manipulated into coming north now, when it's again quite clear that the Biden administration has been sending a message of don't come now, right? That things have not materially changed at the U.S.-Mexico border. And this is going to take a while for there to be material change. And so I think it's important kind of not to lose sight of that, as while we also come to learn better what is the Team Biden is intending to build as they build in the very complex context that we've been discussing for the past hour.
A great point, that one about misinformation. That also has to do with public policy in the future. Alan, please, could you end this?
So quickly, I think Sarah and Theresa have addressed the non-enforcement and the workforce issues. And I think Sarah covered well the so-called Safe Country Agreement and Asylum Cooperative Agreements with the Northern Triangle countries. But there still needs to be focus on how, and I think the question about caravans is right. I agree generally with Dan that I don't see a dramatic change in the enforcement posture, but the politics is almost entirely different now, both in this country and to some extent Mexico. Although one of the remarkable phenomena of the last 3 years is the willingness of the Mexican public to actually accept the kinds of restrictions that have been in place as a result of the Trump AMLO Accords. Whether that continues will actually be essential to the outcome playing out in the short term. The issue of disinformation and messaging is central to the migrant calculus. In the Trump administration, just his coming in slowed down the migration for the first year in 2017, and as people began to understand that he was more bluff than bluster and bluff than reality, you saw the numbers go to something we hadn't seen in almost 40 years. The danger here is that this is all mediated through the smuggler infrastructure, and a infrastructure now more infected by organized crime throughout Mexico than had ever been the case. We saw it growing in past years, but organized crime, transnational criminal organizations are deeply involved in the plaza control. It used to be just at the border. Now it's through many areas of Mexico. So the danger here is that the wrong messages will be sent, but the major difference is that it's not just messages from the U.S. government. It's messages now from the government of Mexico in terms of how and whether it's going to change its recent policies of containment.
Thank you, Alan. We are almost at the end of our gorgeous event, but there is a final, just quick question I want to pose to you. If any of you have a quick answer. Are there concrete plans from the U.S. administration for working with national and local NGOs in Mexico and Central America? Do you have any idea about this? Who would like to talk about that? Okay, Dan, please.
So while making abundantly clear that I do not speak on behalf of the United States government, I think a central feature of the Biden approach, and I think we've seen it here in the opening moves, is close coordination with non-governmental organizations here in the United States, but also because of an understanding that this is a migratory system, this is a migratory chain, that close cooperation cannot be isolated to cooperation with NGOs in the United States. It has to include cooperation with NGOs up and down the migratory chain. And not just by the United States government, obviously.
Theresa, do you want to add something?
As well.
I think
the only thing I would add to what Dan said is that
Theresa? Okay.
Yes, I'm sorry. The only thing I would add to what Dan said on that is that, oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I tried to unmute, it didn't work. The only thing I would add to what Dan said is that I think the US government needs to do what it can to develop more relationships with the NGOs in Mexico and Central America. I don't know that the US government has a lot of relationships now. They're kind of relying on domestic US NGOs to help introduce them, but we would need cooperation from IOM and UNHCR and others in Mexico to make those introductions. And obviously you don't want to engage too far without an understanding with the Mexican government as well. So there's a lot more that has to happen there.
Agree 100%.
Well, we have to close. We have to say goodbye. I'm really very grateful with your questions from the audience. Once again, I'd like to thank our wonderful panelists for their participation. You gave us lots of insight and lots of food for thought. And everyone in the audience who took the time to listen and share questions. I also want to to thank Isabel Gil, Fernando Arnábal, Héctor Gutiérrez y Alberto Chavarría, Cristina Portas y Tania Ochoa for their support organizing this event. I want to invite everyone to keep an eye out for the next seminars. You can find this information at El Colegio de México and the MIGDEP websites. Goodbye and keep safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much.